All right, we can get going. We've been looking forward to this. And those of you who are on Twitter, we've had a lively sort of pre-publicity. So I'm Anne Marie Slaughter. I'm the CEO of New America, and I get to moderate this fabulous discussion today. And we are here to launch David Kaye's book, Speech Police: The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, and equally to celebrate Consent of the Networked, which is 2012, and I'm going to talk about this for a minute, but which was Rebecca MacKinnon's book in 2012, also a New America book. And I was very struck, I'm going to just start with this, when I was reading through the acknowledgments in Speech Police to see, David, you actually say that Rebecca and Consent of the Networked, you say few people have had as much influence on my thinking as that book. And so I thought, well, that is wonderful, and you have to have written that before you knew we were doing this event. So we're going to have a discussion, and then we will turn it over to you. But I wanted to begin by framing the debate in terms of these two books, because I think it says a lot about how the internet has evolved. And the first, when you look at Rebecca's book, Consent of the Networked, the subtitle is The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. Right? So the 2012, the question is internet freedom. And when I was at the State Department working for Secretary Clinton, I was very involved in her speech at the museum, where she talked about the right to connect. And we thought very hard about the importance of being able to connect to the internet as being a freedom, a fundamental freedom, and then what you could do online. And that remains important, but this is 2012. So then you look at Speech Police, and the subtitle is The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet. Now, obviously, freedom is still important, as is democracy, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's striking to me that the subtitle, the sort of focal point, has shifted from freedom, to be free from restraints, to governance, which is the wise restraints, we hope, that make us free. So that, to me, tells us something about how the internet has evolved in ways that none of us might have predicted, although we were just talking before. Larry Lessig seems to have predicted a lot of it, and Rebecca predicted some of it, as I will talk about, but still, very different setting. The other thing I did want to just say in framing is that David's book is Speech Police. And in the book, and often online, we encounter these issues as speech issues. And in the United States, that means you encounter them as First Amendment issues. More broadly, and I do want to talk about this too, you talk about human rights issues, freedom of expression issues. But that's just the portal for the real discussion. The real discussion is the protection of speech, the protection of privacy, the maintenance, preservation, vitalization of democracy. So the second thought I would leave you with is we've moved from freedom to governance, and governance, it's really about participation in governance, and what does democracy look like, liberal democracy, in a world that is as much online as offline. So just thinking about the evolution and sort of some of the big themes, and we will pull these out in conversation, and then, as I said, I will turn to you. But before I do that, I want to properly introduce both of our speakers, and I actually will start with Rebecca, who is the director of Ranking Digital Rights. Ranking Digital Rights is an index that ranks companies around the world, and you can see that you should have been able to pick up the fold-out on it, and more of it's online, based on how well they actually protect digital rights. I'm just going to say that in many ways, I think that work exemplifies what New America strives to be. Rebecca is a big thinker. This book, she was a New America Fellow when she wrote this book. Before that, she was the co-founder of Global Voices, which is actually how I first knew of her in foreign policy. She was CNN's Beijing bureau chief from 1998 to 2001, so she was on, living and working in a country where questions of censorship and freedom of speech were a daily fare. She's a big thinker, and a lot if you go back to Consent of the Network, it's really striking how much she saw. But she strives to connect thought to action, which is really why I say it's where New America strives to be, to take the big ideas about democracy, about consent, about speech, but then to turn them into something that is more practical, that actually does rank companies on an annual basis. So we love the work, and it's important both intellectually and practically. And David Kaye is currently UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And well, you all are a specialized audience, but I am willing to venture that many people do not know that there is a special rapporteur from the UN on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. I like the way it's framed. He's a clinical law professor at UC Irvine. And he teaches international human rights law and directs a clinic, as you might expect, given that he's a clinical professor, in international justice. He has lectured all around the world at the UN, at the International Criminal Court. He's taught at many other law schools. He co-founded the International Human Rights Program at UCLA. And actually began his career as a lawyer in at the U.S. State Department, practicing international law. One of the things that I will be talking about toward the end is how important it is that both of you come out of an international human rights frame, not just a U.S. legal frame. So with that, we will begin our discussion. All right. So. All right, I want to actually start by framing the debate. I just framed it sort of in the broadest ways, but there is a quote on page 7. You can see that this book is dog-eared already. So there's a place where you are talking to the EU Commission, and you're talking about the EU Code of Conduct. And it's interesting because you're talking to an EU official who in the first place is very down on U.S. companies. That's not surprising in the EU, and we can talk about that. But he's talking about the difference between U.S. approaches to freedom of speech, which of course we have by far the most liberal code of freedom of speech. In other words, we protect the least speech, or we protect the most speech of anyone in the world. We limit the least speech. And he talks about words lead to violence and how the Europeans understand this much more than Americans do. And then he says these questions must be decided by democracy, not technology. There's a responsibility beyond the internet. For rights activists, it's always just inside the internet, but the politics regarding the internet today are general societal politics. The bodies of democracy will have to own up to a view for regulating it. And then he says, and this is where I wanted to start, he says, the question isn't what's best for the internet, it's what's best for society. So let me start with that and ask you to elaborate and how is, your book is to govern the internet. Do you think about it as the internet, or do you think about it more broadly?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you for hosting me. Thanks to New America. It's kind of remarkable to sit between two people who have shaped really major fields, the two major fields I work in. So really, it's an honor. So I'm really glad that you pointed that out because one of the points of the book that I'm trying to get across, and particularly I think for an American audience, right, is that the debate over regulation, which is practically non-existent in many respects, with some new changes around competition policy in the United States, the debate around regulation is robust in Europe, and their approach is that the companies have massive impact on public space. Like whether we get into debates over them being publishers or whether they have the public square or whatnot, they see what the companies are doing as having massive impact on their public life, on their access to information, on the rights of individuals in their space. And so from their perspective, this is an issue, particularly at the European Commission, but in Paris, in Berlin, in London. The issue is, how do we protect our society? How do we protect individuals? How do we protect public space? How do we protect public institutions and elections and so forth? And they're having a robust debate about it that we're practically excluded from, in a way, even though the impact of the changes that might come from that will absolutely have some effect on us.
Great. Rebecca.
Yeah, well, I mean, just, coming back to this point, it is what's best for people. I mean, this is the whole point of why we like the internet, right? Is because it's supposed to be good for people. It's supposed to help empower people. So, and the issue about freedom, or internet freedom, as I framed it in my book originally, isn't freedom as in state of nature, free for all. It's freedom in the context of human rights and democracy, in which you need governance, right? Because if you don't have governance, life is nasty, brutish, and short for everybody but the biggest and the strongest, right? And so that's the case online as it is offline. And so the question really is, okay, we've got this resource that's globally interconnected, that's enabling people in communities that used to be very cut off, marginalized, isolated, repressed, with kind of no hope of breaking out, to do so. But at the same time, we need to make sure that this space, as it's being constructed, designed, and governed, that power is held accountable. When somebody exercises power over what I can say or what I can do, whether it's a corporate actor or a government, they're held appropriately accountable, there are appropriate constraints, and also that rights of everybody on the network are protected and respected. And this is where we get into, I think, a lot of really tricky debates, and David was talking about the debate in Europe, and there's also another debate going on, or sort of a reaction to the European debate happening everywhere else, right? Exactly. So in the Middle East, in Asia, and so on, and there's a lot of concern of human rights activists in countries that are not democracies or are kind of quasi-authoritarian democracies, where leaders are picking up on regulatory debates, misconstruing them, and using mechanisms that are being developed in Europe in the context of much more robust rights protections, and actually using those mechanisms to censor dissent. Yeah. And so one of the big challenges, and David's written about this too, that I pointed out in Consent of the Networked, is that our legal systems are based on nation states, they're based on borders, they're based on media that's largely contained within national cultures and ecosystems. Now we have these globally interconnected systems, and our approach to constraining power, our approach to law and geopolitics isn't fit for purpose when it comes to really protecting rights and constraining power and holding power accountable across global networks. And that's one of the major questions that David, of course, is taking much further.
So if we think about it as, so it's not just the internet, it's society, and it's interesting that at some point, David, you refer to companies as custodians of important public spaces, which I thought, the idea that this is a mixed reality. It's not. There's not that line, and the line also between this isn't just one country. This is global. So we're really now talking global democracy. let's talk about who then participates in the governance, right? So let's accept it needs to be a broader conversation than it is now. We're just going to take that as a given. But what is the role of the companies? So there's a part of the book where, David, you describe Facebook's legislative process. And I was reading it thinking, this is like a civics book where we say, you know, you go up to the Capitol Hill and there's a draft of a law and there's markup. Well, this is kind of Facebook's markup session. And you describe a number of people from Facebook, and led by Monica Bickert, who was a law student of mine. So I was sort of interested in, I'm thinking, I hope I taught her civil procedure really, really well. But, you know, where a number of Facebook people from around the world are very earnestly trying to decide what should be taken down and what should be left up. So maybe you want to describe that a little more immediately, but you know, that has to be part of this, right? As long as the companies are there. Who else needs to be in those rooms? Or should we displace that conversation from those rooms entirely?
Right, so there is this Facebook, what Monica calls the mini legislative forum, right? It's a mini legislature, and they are, I think our perception, the public's perception generally around the companies is that they're making seat of the pants kinds of decision making, right? It's an ad hocery. But the truth of the matter is they are incredibly bureaucratized institutions. They have extensive sets of rules that are essentially
They're all lawyers.
There's a lot of lawyers, I mean, their content policy team, particularly at Facebook, which I think we probably agree is the most bureaucratized of them all, which might not surprise anybody in the room. But they are basically making the rules. They're evaluating the interplay of the rules with actual lived experience of people. They're doing all of this, and so they are performing a kind of governance. Kate Klonick describes this as the new governors, and I think that's an accurate description of them. So they're doing, and that's going to persist, right? No matter what happens with the companies, that is going to continue to be a part of the way content is evaluated, because they are, you know, just notwithstanding any move to delete Facebook, hashtag delete Facebook, I guess, which is funny, like crossing platforms there. But using that as, no matter what happens there, it is a massive platform, just as YouTube and to a certain extent Twitter are around the world, and they are governing on their own basically. And a major challenge for the companies right now is, I mean, I think of it in a way as democratization, right? Like, how do they open up their space so that more voices are a part of the decision making around what the rules should be and how the rules are enforced? And so it's one thing to say, you know, this group of like really extraordinary people in Menlo Park make decisions about what happens in the United States. But then when you extrapolate out to the, you know, really over 2 billion users in their community around the world, how do they even think through applying their global rules, which I think we agree should be rooted in human rights law, at least human rights norms? How do they go about enforcing those in all of these different places? How do they involve, so your question I think is a really important one, how do they go about involving the people who are most affected by those rules and the enforcement of those rules?
So, Rebecca, before you take a crack at that, let me ask a prior question. So one clarification is, as you describe it, there's somebody from Dublin. So it's not just Americans in the room, at least. It is Facebook people from around the world.
That's true. That's true. Their forum, it's fascinating.
So it's not just, you know,
it's
like
not just people in Menlo
First
Park.
Amendment people.
No, that's true, but it's really dominated by people who are marinated in First Amendment culture. And so even the non-Americans, although the non-Americans who are involved in the process, I think, bring a kind of sunlight into, like, this is the way the rest of the world thinks about freedom of expression issues. I think that's true.
Really?
Yeah, it's always surprising to people.
Kind of thing.
But I still think it's very much focused on, so at the end of the day, and I think this is like moving into Rebecca's just essential work around pushing for transparency, at the end of the day, we don't really have a good sense of who is making the rules, and ultimately who in the companies is accountable for different kinds of decisions. And so it becomes a little too kind of systemic. So the platform is part of the problem, but at the end of the day, well, maybe Mark Zuckerberg is the final decision maker, and how do we think about that in terms of the impact that they have all around the world?
So that's a terrifying thought, that it all comes down to Mark Zuckerberg. But so to Rebecca, so there are their approaches there. One is, which you are working hard to achieve, one is that those rooms become glass-walled, right? That we can see who's there and what decisions they're making, and we can try to hold them accountable. Another, and it may not be mutually exclusive, is to put more people into those rooms, or somehow.
Sure, yeah,
so how do you think
all
about
those
that?
things. Well, in my book, I called Zuckerberg the Sultan of Facebookistan.
Sultan of Facebook, which is 2.5 billion people.
And talked about the
world.
sovereigns of cyberspace,
Right.
and the sort of unaccountable sovereignty that these companies are exerting over people who, unless you think that clicking I agree, means consent, haven't really, consented or are participating in what's going on. I think there's a number of issues here, and one of these issues is one of the things that we look at with ranking digital rights in terms of applying UN frameworks, human rights frameworks, to company behavior and policies and practices. So we're not just looking for companies to be transparent, we're looking for them to make a commitment and actually provide evidence that they are implementing these commitments in certain ways. And we look at companies' governance, as we call it, around human rights risks. So we're not just looking for them to be transparent about what they're taking down to enforce their content moderation policies, or what they're taking down in response to government demands, but we are looking for companies to conduct what we call human rights impact assessments. Now, Facebook, as a member of something called the Global Network Initiative, which we could talk about later if we want, does make a commitment to conduct human rights impact assessment when it relates to government censorship and surveillance demands. But based on our evaluation, they provide no evidence that they conduct human rights impact assessments on the content of their terms of service, so what their rules are, how they enforce their rules, and what impact their rules are having on the human rights of their users. They do not do any kind of impact assessment. So the decision about what to take down, what not to take down, that's kind of way downstream. But even just what the rules are and how they should be enforced, they have not done systematic thinking about the implications for human rights of their global user base. That is a huge problem. They're not doing human rights impact assessment on their use of AI, artificial intelligence, and they're not doing human rights impact assessments on their targeted advertising business model, which one could argue has a lot to do with why we're having a lot of these speech problems and is generating these downstream issues about what you take down and kind of how you police things. So, and also in terms of remedy and grievance mechanisms, and in order to have these, in order to do an impact assessment properly, to really understand how is my business model going to affect communities in Myanmar and Egypt and anywhere else, you have to be engaging with affected stakeholders and communities around the world to understand that. You have to be engaging with communities around the world to understand, how do I set up a mechanism that when people are being harmed, we have an early warning system, we know who's going to tell us what the problem is and help us fix it, help us come up with a solution. So yes, there needs to be a lot more transparency so that we understand what's being taken down and how things are being enforced, but there also needs to be sort of accountability and governance of risks and impacts to users' human rights. It's just not happening in a systematic way right now.
So, David, I want you to respond to that, but I'm trying to get a sense of, so if they conduct human rights impact assessments, then they're getting more information for how they make those decisions. But they are still making those decisions.
Right.
And so I wonder, is there a way that you can really compel a broader process of public decision-making with these entities that are public squares, but they're not public squares in the sense that they're, you know, like the Capitol Mall. They have terms of service so that, you know, they can restrict speech far more than, say, the U.S. government or European government. How do we get more people into the actual decision-making process?
Well, I mean, it's a really great question, and I think an answer that many governments around the world say is government regulation. So that's, from an American perspective, particularly because we're talking about platforms that are about speech and information, we resist that. But that's the model people are moving towards, and that's where it really becomes extremely problematic for the companies and even for individuals. Right? So think of an example. Right now, I've been thinking a bit about Ethiopia. Right? So Ethiopia is a place actually not all that different from Myanmar in certain respects. In one respect, the lid has been taken off of a repressive regime.
Right.
And over the last year, there's been a lot of new media and a lot of robust debate on the platforms, but also hate speech, ethnic division that has been surfacing, and so forth. And this is where I think Rebecca's exactly right. There should be a process. And again, I mean, the platforms are first responders. No matter what kind of regulatory environment is created, the platforms are always going to be in the position of having to have a first response. There's just so much, the volume is so ridiculous, it's so huge that they're always going to have to be in that position. But they should be doing, at the first level, they should be evaluating what is the impact of Facebook on the political situation and on the public in Ethiopia. How do we address that? They need to have a process that not only gives them kind of a playbook for doing that kind of assessment, but also one that is signed off by Mark and Cheryl, let's say. I mean, and that's true for YouTube and Twitter. It needs to have that kind of accountability mechanism in order to say, we're doing this, we're evaluating our impact, and we're going to go forward or we're not going to go forward, but it's a company decision, and these people will be held accountable for our decisions. Now, what that means...
How are they going to know anything about Ethiopia?
Well, so that's fundamentally the problem. Right. And this actually gets to, I think, a deeper question for us about whether it's even solvable. Right. I don't want to go too dark quite yet.
Yet, just at the end.
but there is, I mean, I do have a question. We talk a lot about, right now in the US, particularly since Chris Hughes' op-ed in the New York Times, about breaking up Facebook. But there's also another kind of a possibility, and that's breaking down Facebook. How do we get it closer to the communities that they're involved in? And it's not just a matter of getting those communities some insight and access to the decision-making and the rulemaking. It's also, how do you do that while preventing government from capturing the process? Because we also don't, I mean, that's why this is not some, there's not a one-size-fits-all. And so going to the communities might work in certain ways in, say, democratic Europe that wouldn't work in other countries, in Turkey, for example. That wouldn't work as a model. So that's why there's not an overall global answer to the question of how do you involve users. It's not, as Mark Zuckerberg used to say, I don't think he says it as much, Facebook is a community. And everybody in Silicon Valley would roll their eyes at that, as would we probably. It's not one community. There needs to be difference. And I don't know at the scale of 2.5 billion users, and YouTube is close, do they have the tools to really manage that kind of process? They have the money to put into it, but do they have the tools to engage people so it looks more democratic, so it looks more like they're engaging the people who are actually affected by their decisions?
Although at one point I think you do suggest like country teams. There was something in the that really made me think this is just a mini State Department, right? With ambassadors and country teams.
For Facebookistan, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I think that's right. I mean, they need to find ways to actually have a presence in the places. I mean, they call them markets, but in the jurisdictions, in the the countries where they're operating, they need to figure out a way to have a presence. So it's not just language, because language only gets you so far. The code around language, around social norms, around all sorts of memes that develop, that you can't get all the way there just by knowing Burmese, for example. You need to know a lot more than that. But then again, there is this problem. Like if they go to the country, there's also the risk of them being captured and actually literally being captured. Brazilian judges have ordered Facebook executives to be arrested. And they've been detained. So it's a very complicated dance in a way, but they so far have not really been making the kind of full effort to get to local actors. And that means not just at the national level, but at the most local levels.
So Rebecca, you're actually doing this, right? Ranking digital rights is a way of of holding companies accountable that is not government regulation, right? I mean, you're doing it here, right? It's a benchmark. It could help inform governments. How do you think about, if you're wildly successful, companies are paying attention to ranking digital rights. They are paying attention to, and again, both of you, and I'll just say this again, are using a global human rights framework, not a US constitutional framework, not a European Convention framework, a global human rights framework. How do you imagine, or where do you imagine governments and/or watchdog groups participating in that larger project?
Sure. Well, ranking digital rights is a tool. It's kind of a set of data and a framework of standards for people to use in a whole ecosystem of efforts, right? That includes regulation, that includes advocacy, that includes all kinds of things. So in a way, you see sustainability benchmarks that benchmark companies on, how they're doing with their carbon footprint,
right,
and so on, that are quite successful and have a huge impact on company, not only their policies and practices, but innovation, and also kind of helps to inform regulation in terms of, what impact is the regulation actually having on the practices, what companies are going beyond just compliance with the law, what companies are just doing minimum compliance, and so on. And so that's kind of what we modeled on. It's modeled it on is these sustainability benchmarks or benchmarks that are ranking companies on like their labor practices and other things. And you see that, again, it alone, having a benchmark is not going to do all the work. But we're seeing, for example, with our data this year, we're able to make some initial kind of observations on what impact privacy regulation in Europe has had and what impact it hasn't had, and what companies are going above and beyond the regulation and what companies are just doing minimum compliance as they interpret it as compliance, and they're not getting very good scores. And so it's sort of a tool to really understand kind of what companies are doing and how they compare. It's also a framework around which to have debates, because it's a living thing. We keep updating the standards that we're using to evaluate companies about what best practice should look like. So we're going to be adding indicators related to targeted advertising, related to artificial intelligence that we didn't have.
And where do you
before.
get that best practice,
Right.
though?
So it's a lot of consultation and research. So the indicators we have right now, they're based on human rights standards, but we had to build a lot of detail into it, and the detail was built through talking to a lot of people in the human rights community, to talking to companies, to talking to technologists, and working out, okay, what represents kind of a general rough consensus about what good should look like. What it should look like if companies are, in fact, being accountable and responsible about all the ways in which people's speech people are someone's speech could be manipulated or constrained, and all the ways in which somebody might be able to know something about your digital activity. Are companies acting sort of to maximum transparency and accountability around that? That our indicators are kind of an indication of, that's what the standard should be, but it's based on, none of it is really original work. It's all drawing on the work of others that has come to be considered best practice.
I would just add just really quickly that I think this is really important because, there needs to be a smart set of regulations, right? I think that content regulation by governments is incredibly risky and will lead to repression of speech. But what RDR is doing, I think, is not only modeling what the companies should be doing, but also if governments want to think about the kind of regulation that would allow for a more robust and symmetric public debate, they should be adopting these standards themselves. And I don't have a problem with governments basically saying, one requirement for selling ads in our jurisdiction is to be transparent along these lines.
So that means that the mini legislative forum in New America would become as important as the mini legislative forum in Menlo Park. But David, let me push you further on. How do you think about that from your vantage point at the UN? Because what I'm struck by then is thinking about So you're at the UN. The UN is, 194 countries. Facebook is the biggest country, but even just by market cap, if we leave aside population, it is way, way up there, above most of the countries in the UN. How do you think about how the UN should engage with things like RDR, with Article 19, the many NGOs, and with the governments, right? Because the UN, and there are plenty of governments at the UN who would like to just, regulate away. Yeah. How do we think of a global legislative process? Yeah. And what would you, if I am Antonio Guterres and I say to you, okay, so we're the UN in the digital age, what's the process? What do you tell me?
Yeah, you should tell him to talk to me. Call me.
I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah. So I do think, I think the UN, at least in the human rights mechanisms, right? So that's the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly Third Committee to a certain extent. I think that the UN can serve a really important function in identifying what are both the global, so what are the global norms around freedom of expression online? Have they changed? There's this mantra that online and offline are the same, right? That whatever rights you have offline, apply online. And that should be true in principle, but it doesn't go far enough into identifying, well, what does that mean in terms of how companies and governments should be protecting that space, should be requiring, what we use in our wonky language, how do the companies and how do governments encourage an enabling environment for freedom of expression? And so I do think that there's a lot of room for the UN to basically say, look, the rules, for example, around transparency, and transparency can be a meaningless mantra if we don't specify it as RDR does. So what are the disclosures that might be important so that the public can have a genuine debate over that? And that's access to information, which is also a human right, right? So how do we construct rules around that? But then also the UN can basically say to governments, look, when you are constructing your regulations, you need to be sure not to cross over into space that incentivizes the companies to take down more content than they should be allowed to put up based on human rights law. And that's why, I do think, and I think, again, we're on the same page on this, is that if the companies were to essentially revamp their community standards and rules around human rights norms, I think that would give them a stronger tool in dealing with governments that are repressive. So governments come to them now and say, we want you to take down this content because it's inconsistent with your terms of service. So the company can say right now, well, that's actually not inconsistent with our terms of service, so we want to leave it up. The country doesn't care. But if the companies are able to go back and say, look, we see ourselves as protecting individual rights, which you yourself, as a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that you yourself are bound to adhere to, then I think it doesn't mean that Turkey is going to say, oh, you're right, we're bound by this norm. But I think in many instances it will slow down the process. And if it's coupled with transparency around that, it does make it harder for governments to just willy-nilly take down content or make demands of the companies to take down content.
This is really, as an international lawyer, this is fascinating because U.S. companies through the 20th century were the vehicles through which essentially U.S. law was applied extraterritorially around the world, right? And now, when you read both these books, you suddenly think, actually, these companies are global, and they are actually bringing global human rights law and European law into the U.S., which is just such a flip in terms of the way we've talked about it. I've got 10 more minutes before I turn it to the audience. I'd like to talk about, to get more specific, and really look at the disinformation question, right? The fake news question, which again, propaganda, lies, the fact that it's called fake news, it's not new, and it's very much not new in many of the countries that you all are both looking at. And so, David, talk about how, as UN rapporteur, you have seen the disinformation and then democracy and disinformation, and then the rush to counter that, and what the implications of that are around the world. And then I'll turn to Rebecca to comment.
Yeah, I think so. We've seen really since 2016, I mean, since the election of Donald Trump, let's say, when there was kind of a collective freakout that, and that's not a technical term, but there was kind of a collective freakout that, there was a particular New York Times op-ed that basically said, Facebook, you've got, gazillion engineers working for you. You should figure out a way to zap the fake news and, and basically save our democracy. And that kind of idea, I think, has, traveled quite far around the world to the point where, just a few weeks ago, Singapore adopted a new law. It's called the the Prevention of Online Falsehoods Act. And basically, it criminalizes the dissemination of false information, of fake news, online falsehoods. But it also basically gives government ministers the authority to make demands of the companies to correct false information, to label it and to maybe take it down, but either way to put up something that says, this information, well, the government disputes it. So there's a real, it's not just a risk. I mean, the reality now, and there are many false information laws that criminalize dissemination of so-called fake news that are basically used against government dissidents, right?
That's
critics.
Terrifying.
But that is the world that we're heading to. And one of my fears is that the debate in Europe has been incentivizing that. It's been giving cover to that. And I think, the point that Rebecca made earlier around this particular area, and particularly the way regulatory discussions travel worldwide, is really important, because it's not to say that Europe shouldn't do something because Russia might take advantage of it. It's not exactly that. It's that the entire conversation around the internet, particularly on disinformation, and particularly in Europe, is the internet is bad. And it doesn't give much room for thinking about the trade-offs that are, and the proportionality of restrictions that are a part of both legal traditions, but also a part of what we want to preserve in the good there. So, I mean, this doesn't get to what the rules should be around disinformation. I mean, the last point I would just say is, again, at least the liberal freak out over the Pelosi video was pretty instructive, right? This is not just a question of, this authoritarian regime beyond our borders, wanting false information to be shut down. It's also here, and I think we have to think about whether our own debate is kind of giving cover to illiberal moves, which you described in Consent to the Networks, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's a debate going on within people, just even in DC, who work on digital rights issues over how to address this question, and with intermediary liability. Should Section 230 be reformed or not, and how much, and so on. But also just this question of, a lot of people reacted to the Pelosi video saying, well, it's really easy, if it's a fake. If it's a fake thing and it's about yourself, you should be able to have the company take it down. And then, of course, everybody pointed to all kinds of satire
on Donald Trump,
on Trump, on William Barr, and so on. That's just, it's obviously satire, but could technically be taken down under such a rule. And so well, David had a famous tweet recently. It's like, so please give me a rule that will deal with, prevent manipulation, but at the same time not result in over censorship. And the debate around that was really fascinating. And there's not easy answers, but I think this is part of the problem, is that there's, I think, often an approach to regulation of the internet or anything related to the internet, or expectations about what companies can do with their platforms. It's like, you just fix it. Like you fix the TV. Like Samsung's TV had a bug and you just fix the bug and then it's fixed, right? We're not going to fix that. We're not going to fix issues of speech and kind of where the line needs to be and have a perfect rule, whether it's a company's private rule or a law or whatever, that's going to satisfy everybody. Just as in governing a city, we're never going to have perfect law enforcement that never infringes anybody's rights, that everybody, and services that everybody's really happy with how how they're set up, right? You never will, and nor will you with the digital space in terms of how it's designed and regulated. It's going to be a constant battle, tug of war around how speech and data are governed, and that's normal and natural, and it's when we get to the point where it's not possible to have that debate, that's where you're really in trouble. And so it's more about how do we ensure that as rules evolve, that there's the possibility to continue to identify where the abuse is and adjust, just as we do in the governance of our physical spaces. It's just not going to get fixed.
I do think that's very important to recognize that, you're just going to have to be making trade-offs. So maybe if I think about going back to law school, right, it's nothing but hypotheticals where, you draw a line and the cases on either side of that line don't make much sense, but you have to have a line, and there will always be trade-offs. But I'm very mindful, David, when you were saying about, if Europe regulates something and says it's fake news. This is like when the U.S. allowed torture, right? We allowed torture, and in a limited way, as far as I was concerned, it should have been no way. But of course, that licensed governments around the world to do things far worse than we were doing. And I remember being in the State Department and human rights activists coming and saying, look, people are pointing to you. The U.S. government is doing this. We can do this. And the same, yes, if Europe, which is obviously a deeply rights-protecting environment, then essentially starts to license censorship. And the idea, British libel law, you can't say what's not true. In the U.S., it's fine to say what's not true. You just can't defame.
And this, the one way I would flip this a little bit is that, what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. Right? So, and that's not a question just about whether, Egypt or Singapore or someone else adopts a rule. It's also about the fact because the companies operate at scale, if they have a new European law around, say, hate speech or disinformation, I can't say for certain, but it's easier for the company to make a decision that, okay, we will just import that into our terms of service. And so the rule that's adopted for Europe will actually be the rule that also frames how Americans get to enjoy the platform. And so, it's an interesting, right? We don't, as Americans, don't often think that we might actually be affected by other people's rules. But this is one area where, looking forward, that is absolutely a possibility that, and particularly because we're not, as a political culture right now, not really having a serious debate on these issues, Europe will make the decision. Maybe we'd in this room be happy with that, but we're not participating in it.
Right. All right, that seems like the right moment to reach out there. Yes, on the aisle. And wait for a microphone, please, and then introduce yourself. The gentleman in the light suit halfway down here. Yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Toby Mackintosh. I run a mighty small blog called Eye on Global Transparency. David, you spoke about wanting to have disclosure of rules and decisions. You seem to suggest that there also should be disclosure about the process of a transparent decision-making process. Do you have a model for that, for the corporate transparency in that realm? And do you have a strategy for getting there?
Yeah, Toby, thanks for coming here. This is an access to information stalwart, and what I wanted to, the one way to respond to that is, so I talk about having a kind of case law around platform decisions, right? So right now we get very little out of the companies in terms of at the granular level as to how they make decisions, and like from the platform's perspective, I think that's actually, it's harmed them. The debate around many of these issues are, well, they're inconsistent. They look inconsistent, and certainly they seem inconsistent because we don't know about the range of other kind of like cases that they've addressed. And from time to time, they will throw up, and YouTube has done this, they'll put up some hypotheticals, but they should be pushing themselves, and we should be pushing them, I think, to provide more and more granularity about their specific decisions. And again, so it's not just some generic transparency, it's disclosing for a couple of reasons. One, so that we can have a debate that we're all more or less, on the same page with the same information. But it would also give users the opportunity to decide whether they want to be on the platforms, which I think is, right now it's very difficult not to be on many of the platforms, particularly outside the United States, but at least if people have information about rules, about sharing of data and all these things, they're in a better position. That advances their ability to protect their own rights.
Yeah, and we were talking yesterday, Michael Chertoff was talking about data portability being an absolutely essential sort of part of any competition and any ability for choice. Yes, they're in the very back, yep.
I wonder if you guys,
Just
my name is Mark
introduce yourself.
Nelson from the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy. I wonder if you guys could say a few words about the multi-stakeholder governance approach of the internet. I mean, that gives voice to people. It doesn't work very well, but we haven't taken it very seriously as a country in the international arena. And I just wonder if you think there's a potential to move more toward a multi-stakeholder approach that would give voice to local media producers and others who are really shut out of a lot of these decisions and would be probably in a more legalized framework. I just wonder if you don't think that has potential.
Great question.
Sure, I'm happy to give a stab at it, and I'm sure, I mean, there are a number of multi-stakeholder processes evolving around addressing particular problems. I think when people think about multi-stakeholder internet governance, we think about ICANN and kind of that model, which is very specific around the names and numbering of, the internet domain name system, and doesn't deal with a lot of other things. And then you have a lot of multi-stakeholder talk shops that aren't really governing anything, like the Internet Governance Forum. But the question is, I think the best work on kind of where we might take multi-stakeholder governance is Laura DeNardis, where she talks about, rather than trying to have one multi-stakeholder body to govern all things and solve all problems, that it's rather more likely to be effective to have different multi-stakeholder efforts that bring together the people concerned with, involved, are affected by, and have the expertise on, one specific issue, say like content moderation on Facebook, and try to come up with a mechanism that brings in stakeholders to figure out a better way forward than to have some big body that kind of governs everything that relates to the internet. So, and we are starting to see some efforts that are bringing together stakeholders, including governments and NGOs and other, press organizations and so on. But
yeah, I mean, I would only add to that, just sort of following on that point, I mean, so Article 19, the organization, has been promoting this idea of social media councils. So it's non-governmental, but definitely multi-stakeholder approaches to dealing with, the most difficult content kinds of questions. And I think that might be one of the approaches that would, I mean, who knows if it would work, but I think it's promising, and it goes back to Anne-Marie, your question about how do you actually, democratize the space, how do you get involvement of communities, particularly if you imagine social media councils in different regions or even different national jurisdictions. Again, there's the problem of government capture, but that might be a model of bringing in different actors to be participants in the decision making.
Right. And I'll just add that Fadi Chahade, who used to be the head of ICANN, has a elaborate proposal at the UN for these sort of multi-stakeholder groups all rolling up into a network of networks that, as somebody who's written extensively on webcraft as opposed to statecraft, I love the idea. When you actually see it laid out, it's horrifically complex, but we got to start somewhere. Yes, right there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Brian. I'm a researcher affiliated at the University of Oxford, and I wanted to narrowly turn to the question of terrorist content online and how to address it. It most recently manifested with the New Zealand gun violence shooting, which was live streamed. And my question is, how should countries like the US and countries which care about protecting human rights address things like the Christchurch call to action and similar statements at the G20 and the G7, like the Taormina statement addressing that call on social media companies to basically censor all terrorist violent content online?
I'm glad you raised that. I didn't have a chance to get to terrorism, and so.
Yeah. So just first so I think there's at least, there's a million different ways we can talk about terrorist content, and 2 points that I would make. So one is there's there's a new or soon to be adopted, I'm not sure if it was even adopted before the European elections, the terrorist content directive in the European Union. And one of the problems with much of the regulation around terrorist content that's come out of Europe is, like, on the one hand, it's a legitimate thing for government to be doing. There's no question about that. But they often adopt rules, and it's worse in other parts of the world. They often adopt rules that are generally vague. They don't provide the kind of precision that we would want to ensure that the platforms are incentivized to leave up robust debate and not take down debate that is legitimate but might be edgy or problematic for some government. So the one part of it is any regulation on terrorist content needs to be really precise as to what it's aiming to prevent online. The other part of it is the more technical side, and it might have to do with live streaming, because we've seen, after the Christchurch massacre, we saw Australia, propose on a Tuesday and adopt on a Thursday a new law on live streaming. I think it's abhorrent violence is what they called it. And putting aside the real deep problems with adopting a law that quickly without public input, there might be room to have a real debate over live streaming and its impact. I think we need empirical evidence, like a real research around the impact of live streaming and the impact of video on incitement to violence. I think we need more. We need to see more in that framework. But we also, there may be possibilities for certain kinds of trade-offs around certain kinds of content, like live streaming, that gives space for the companies to make decisions that aren't as, they don't require the same kind of timeliness that they do as in the Christchurch situation. So delays in live streaming, for example. But that the trade-off is we also like to see live streaming of public protest. We like to see live streaming of police abuse.
Say Phil
right?
Castile, the
Exactly.
video.
So those kinds of things are, so this is all about trade-offs when we're talking about the technology.
Yeah, there's been a number of articles recently from the human rights community about how Syrian groups trying to document war crimes, their videos are disappearing from YouTube as YouTube is reacting to pressure from regulators to take down terrorist content, and they're getting it wrong, and that's the result.
Yep.
And so that's one very specific example of how what happens when governments impose requirements that, you're liable unless you keep everything that fits this bad category off your platform. They're going to over-censor in order to avoid the penalty.
Exactly.
And that's well documented, always what happens. And so and which is why I argue that if companies aren't doing enough way upstream, just to kind of, before Facebook rolled out its live streaming feature, did they do any kind of impact assessment other than how it was going to help them commercially? I'm pretty sure they didn't. Yeah. And so requiring more kind of impact assessment and again consultation and kind of governance, I think, way further upstream before features get implemented about how you're going to deal with the downsides. There just hasn't been enough thought put into it.
Which means elaborating their legislative process, because that's what Congress has to do, right? And that there was right there in the, yes.
Thank you. My name is Amr Gharbiya. I look at human rights situation in Egypt. David and Rebecca, you spend a lot of time thinking of how to regulate the big companies and ranking digital rights and so on. And I wouldn't be exaggerating to say that most of the social liberals are putting the effort there. Meanwhile, social liberals will use the platforms while they can, And when we are successful pushing them out, they'll go elsewhere to the open, federated, unregulated internet that I grew up on, the messy one that we all remember from old times. Extending this, how does this benefit speech? This way we'll end up with social liberals in the open internet and social liberals talking in the high-walled, regulated, big platforms.
It's aimed at you. Either one.
So I wasn't sure, when you introduced sort of the situation where you're coming from, I think, and I'm not sure I totally caught all the question. I mean, there's two different things that I think about when I think about a place, like Egypt right now. And actually, RDR, I think, started out with much more on the, and continuing to do this, on the government transparency, as what sort of that relationship between what are the companies,
need to be transparent about government demands.
exactly, what are companies sharing about
What governments ask them to
are
do.
demanding. And that, and even the Global Network Initiative, which Rebecca mentioned earlier, got its start in many ways in thinking about how to deal with government repression of online space and what should be the company's response to all of that. So, I think in thinking about some of the issues that you're mentioning, it seems to me that, first off, the companies do need to have kind of a playbook, right, in how to deal with the situations that you're describing. And that means, I think Rebecca puts it perfectly, it's upstream. It's deciding in advance so that we're not really the guinea pigs of the process, deciding in advance what the situation should look like for them and providing tools for individuals. Maybe it's through decentralization and other tools, but providing those mechanisms for people to enjoy their rights.
I think also, Amr, you may be kind of referring to a situation where maybe, Facebook and Twitter get cleaned up, but then 4chan and 8chan are full of nasty people who are basically doing things without any consequence. And this is a huge, and this also relates to offline, right? So just for instance, law enforcement and a bunch of other issues about these groups and kind of how their online activities are connecting to who they are offline and what governments are supporting or not supporting their existence and that kind of thing. But the other thing I think that some of the companies, and there have been discussions with some of the platforms, because researchers point out that oftentimes what happens is that, violent extremists will start out in 4chan and 8chan and kind of organize memes and organize a strategy for how they're going to then jump into Facebook and just go right up against the terms of service but not cross them to get across what they, so they kind of plan, refine their campaigns and then move them over and with very clear strategies to stay within the rules so they don't get taken down or that they evade notice and that kind of thing. And so there obviously needs to be, and this is why it's so important that platforms work with researchers and other communities that are tracking extremists of different kinds to be able to alert the platforms to what, this is what they're planning. Don't let it happen. That kind of, there just needs to be a lot more conversation and cooperation, it seems like.
All right, last question. Yes. And if you have any final closing remarks, since we're...
Hold them in.
Hi, my name is David Madden. I'm the founder of a Myanmar organization called Pandia. So Pandia was one of the main groups in Myanmar that has been battling with Facebook about the hate speech problem in Myanmar. And I wanted to make a comment on, I think we were talking earlier about the sort of the importance of kind of who's in the room and who's participating. And I guess I just wanted to make a point about the sort of the limitations of that. And for various reasons, Pandia and a number of other civil society groups in Myanmar had unprecedented levels of access to Facebook. I personally went to Facebook headquarters in 2015 and told them that Facebook was going to be in Myanmar what radios had been in Rwanda. We went back with a long list of very detailed product and policy recommendations, the things they needed to do. That was in 2017, at the beginning of 2017, before what later transpired in Rakhine State. So, I mean, everybody knows the rest of the story, right? And I think for us in Myanmar, the counterpoint, of course, is Germany, right? Where, we for years could barely find a Burmese-speaking person at Facebook, contractor or otherwise. Whereas in Germany, where they actually have regulation, there's over 1,000 content moderators, and hate speech and incitement to violence is coming down with 24 hours, or they're facing massive fines. And I think what's stark here is that we maybe have global platforms, but we definitely have multiple tiers of global citizens, right? So the rules that are applying to folks in Germany, like the kind of environment that a Facebook user in Germany enjoys, is completely different from a Facebook user in Myanmar. And I think we just need to recognize the limits, even when you have deep civil society engagement, and it's quite technical, down to like product recommendations, like the limitations of that. And I think frankly, it's sobering.
So it was a great last question and a question to end on. I'll just add to it. You do write about digital colonialism, and I underlined it several times, exactly that, standards set in one place and maybe even with strong engagement being applied to those who don't have the ability to do anything about it. So I'll let you.
Well, it's a really important question, and it makes me think that maybe over the last hour or so we've been too easy on the companies. Because I think you're absolutely right, and one of the things that I tried to write a little bit about in the book is the difference, exactly what you're discussing, right? The difference between like these powerful markets, because at the end of the day the companies see them as markets.
Yeah.
So the powerful markets in Europe, so think of something like the right to be forgotten, right? So you had, existing rule of law structure, you had litigation as a mechanism, you had, the top court in the European Union make a decision, and it forced Google to make decisions and to adjudicate, which is a weird thing, but to adjudicate, relevance for when somebody wants a link taken down. That isn't available, put aside Myanmar. I mean, it's not available anywhere. You go to a place, I've been in, I was recently in Ethiopia as an example. Again, I think and Myanmar is a cautionary tale for Facebook and Ethiopia. And, people there have no idea how to even reach out to the company. And putting that aside, your point is right. Even if they get access, what's the guarantee that that Facebook will do the right thing or YouTube would do the right thing? I think that is a big question, and I do think it's why we should be moving from a place. So first, we do need transparency, but we also need to talk about remedy, because where platforms facilitate harm, it can't be that there's just basically an absence of compensation, of reparation for that kind of damage. And maybe if we move towards something like that, and to making that part of the discussion, we start to at least resolve and start to force the companies to see that it doesn't really matter if the harm is coming from Germany or Myanmar. They need to treat it all the same and act against all of it.
Yeah. One could say many things, but we're out of time. So I'm just going to end on an optimistic note, which is that we've actually come a long way. 10 years ago, the policy discourse was, give everybody the internet and they will be set free, and we just need lots of VPNs and everything will become democratic. We've gotten a lot more sophisticated, both on the policy side and kind of everywhere else. While we're very, very far from solutions, the point is you never have solutions. Look at governance writ large in the world, but people are identifying the problems, working on the problems. I've interacted enough with people in the companies to know there are people in these companies who realize that the status quo is completely untenable. And so, some of the questions, how to empower those people and help them kind of move the dial in their companies. And also, I think we're at an interesting moment in the United States where, right now, kind of U.S. leadership on what global internet policy to sustain democracy ought to look like. We're not seeing a whole lot of leadership on that question, but maybe there's potential for some leadership in the future, and what should that look like? And so there's some important questions we can work on, and it's we've got a long way to go. This is a multi-generational issue, but point is, people are trying.
Well, that's so, and both of you have done a great deal to advance that debate. I'll close with my own reflection on the companies and what I'm left with, and reading Speech Police most recently, is thinking about, they're companies, they're commercial entities. They think about these as markets, and yet these are the public spaces, and so they cannot just be companies. And of course, it comes up over and over again that what really drives their response is when advertisers don't want to be associated with either genocide or ethnic cleansing or terrorist videos or others. But I was thinking, when I was a law professor, when Monica Bickert and many others were in my classes, I would say, you as a lawyer, you represent your client, but you are also a servant of the court. That is what you must be. You are part of a system of the rule of law, and you have an obligation to uphold that system. You're a servant of the court, and you are, of course, representing somebody. And somehow, in this process of talking about new legislative processes, people have got to be able to be both commercial and public, because governments can't do it alone, but certainly the companies can't. But we can't just let these be commercial entities that respond to commercial incentives. So I thank you both. I thank all of you for your questions, and join me in a round of applause. This is great.